Hi all, welcome back. So this lecture is based on the biopic by Spike Lee, the movie Malcolm X, 1992. Works best if you watch that already, all 3 hours and 22 minutes of it. Yeah, it's a long one. And it's a good film in that it gives us an opportunity to really see the freedom struggle through story. And we're going to take that further today here, but by historicizing Black nationalism, which really is a movement out of which Elijah Muhammad and the Nation of Islam, which Malcolm X is converted, are one aspect. And the film raises a lot of important questions that Malcolm X himself raised over strategy, over tactics, over the very social contract. And it makes us ask again whether the American dream will always have a color bar. And we know that these questions, they continue into our own times. Now, to start with, Malcolm X clearly, and that needs being said from the outset and is a big theme in today's lecture, is about rejecting integration. And of course, that brings up the debate. What are civil rights about? How does the African American take up the challenge of A, claiming their freedom, and B, their security of person? And there's a really significant divide here between these two faces of the movement. And in the 1960s, we do know that Martin Luther King was by far the bigger force. So to the extent that we're fascinated with Malcolm X, and we are for many good reasons, that really needs pointing out. So I challenge you to ask people you know who lived through this time and what they recall. And I think they'll tell you the same thing I'm telling you, which is that Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam was very much the marginal movement. That really the face of the civil rights movement is the big six, including Martin Luther King, the Congress of Racial Equality, basically the same group. Going back a little further, the SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And yeah, Martin Luther King is the big face of the movement, and that needs to be set right because the film might suggest otherwise. It might suggest a bit of a parity between the two. It's definitely, though, the NOI and Malcolm a really important movement because of that central question over strategy. And that's where there is parity. This divide here between MLK and Malcolm represents and replicates this very old tension, in fact, over tactics in two very different worldviews within the African American community about how to respond first to slavery and then to Jim Crow inequality. So that long historic American freedom movement. And that's one point I want to make, because it's perpetuating this divide that takes us back at least to the late 19th century. And that's when you had the same divide, almost exactly the same, between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, their division is analogous to what we get with Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X, and that is over the simple question of whether you could bring change by working within the existing system. Okay, whether you could bring change with working within the existing system. That's that central divide. And Booker T. Washington, living a very different life than Du Bois, living in the South with his Tuskegee Institute and having to deal with Jim Crow on a daily basis. He believes that you could get there by being respectful. By being respectful, you will earn white man's respect and then eventually civil rights. Du Bois says no, that completely the opposite. That white America will never respect this Uncle Tom approach, and that what Booker T is laying down here is simply a recipe for continuing the status quo, for perpetuating the status quo. And what you need instead is to prove you're worthy of respect through persistent manly agitation. And eventually, he believes, a revolutionary approach because he embraces communism. So definitely not working within the system. Now, so this is, like I say, perpetuating a very old divide in the African American freedom movement. The difference being that W.E.B. Du Bois never said no to integration as the end goal. Malcolm X and the movement does more than anyone to make it clear that the end goal is not integration. He is very clear on calling out the civil rights leaders in his era as being on the wrong side of history there. In fact, he says Martin Luther King is a fool for wanting integration as an end goal, as you can see there in a direct quote from him. And the film does a great job of reinforcing that. He also calls MLK a modern-day Uncle Tom. He calls his March on Washington the farce on Washington. He says this too. The white man pays Reverend Martin Luther King, subsidizes Reverend Martin Luther King, so that Reverend Martin Luther King can continue to teach the Negroes to be defenseless. He also says this, and I love this one. He says, you got to stop singing, start swinging, which is pretty awesome. Many other things as well that come out of Malcolm X's mouth are great sound bites. And he comes quite close to advocating violence. In his very famous speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, which I really encourage you to get online and read the whole thing, it's just amazing. He says this at one point. He says, when you know you are within the law, within your legal rights, within your moral rights, in accord with justice, then die for what you believe in. But let it be reciprocal. This is what is meant by equality, end quote. He also said, if you're not ready to die for it, take the word freedom out of your vocabulary. And in that long Ballot or the Bullet speech too, he takes on Malcolm X and the SCLC for their temerity, for their tepid approach. And then he even takes on Billy Graham. He says Billy Graham is white nationalism. We are black nationalism. Point is, in all this, he couldn't be more different than Martin Luther King. And by the way, you can find a couple good YouTubes where they position them next to each other as a kind of a debate back and forth, because Martin Luther King never did take the bait to do a direct debate with Malcolm X. Watching those might be a great way to start this topic. Okay, so I also want to highlight this book here because it represents the fact that there's been a historiographical tendency since the 1990s in biographies on Malcolm X and also within books on the civil rights movement to minimize the difference between the two and to emphasize the fact that Martin Luther King is becoming more radical as he gets older, as he gets further along in the movement. And Malcolm X, as you know from the film, has this turn towards moderation right before he is murdered. So it's also worth pointing out that MLK chooses not to take up the bait that Malcolm X throws him. Instead, he takes the higher road. Others not so much, but he does. And here's King after Malcolm's death. He says, Malcolm X did serve a role. I think he played a role in pointing out the problem. But his great problem was an inability to emerge with a solution, which I think is a fair comment. He said that he said before that, while Malcolm X is still alive, in defending nonviolence against the barbs of Malcolm, he said, there's a great deal of difference between non-resistance to evil and non-violent resistance. Key point. Non-resistance leaves you in a state of stagnant passivity and dead-end complacency, wherein non-violent resistance means you do resist in a very strong and determined manner. So he has to articulate what he is about in the face of with Malcolm X as his foil, right, as his challenge. Okay, so that's where we begin the lectures, just admitting of these two are polar opposite sides and that they are radically different strategies, but also reinforcing that they're two sides of the same coin, and that by the end they're much more on the same page and wanting the same thing. But for most of Malcolm X's short life, his struggle was absolutely a different end goal, and that's what matters. It's not about integration at all, it's about separation. And he comes out of a very long history, and that's what I want to look at today. And to begin with that, it needs to be said that the African American freedom struggle is as old as slavery itself. From the very beginning, slaves are combining with natives and creating problems for their owners. And we see that in Bacon's Rebellion in the 1680s, that soon, right? We see it with slaves combining with natives and running off to Florida. We see them setting up their own maroon communities and being a real threat. We see them rebelling since the 18th century. They even destroyed much of Carolina in the Yamasee Rebellion. So we have a really long history of agency and violence by African Americans in this freedom struggle. By the 19th century, we have what we call the Black Nationalist movement. Okay, so the antebellum era, we get radical abolitionism now that we know that we properly call the Black Nationalist movement. And David Walker's appeal is a really important document and moment in that. And it goes out, it was written actually in 1829, David Walker's appeal. And it's fascinating because David Walker lives in the North, and he's writing this incendiary appeal for basically a slave insurrection in the South. And it drives the planter class insane because they cannot get him. They put bounties out on his head for multiple thousands of dollars, so he has to live in relative isolation after this appeal. But it is published broadly, goes throughout the South, and he's untouchable because of where he lives. But he says things in this like this, and I encourage you to read it. Believe that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who's trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty. So important theme in Black nationalism going way back, that this is completely acceptable. What David Walker also said, and I should have mentioned, he says, America is more our country than it is the white man's. And what he means by that is we have created this country with the sweat of our brow, right, and our blood. And so there very much anticipates what the kind of rhetoric that you will get in the 1960s with Malcolm X. Yeah, and Black nationalism, again, not being new. And part of this is a branch of this, I guess you might say, is immediatism. This which is largely something that is, well, it's an integrated movement, and many of the leaders in it are white, like William Lloyd Garrison, who we've been introduced to before, and John Brown. William Lloyd Garrison famously burning the Constitution at his talks. He calls it a pact with the devil, hugely offensive to many Americans. And John Brown, of course, willing to kill to see an end to slavery, as were many others. Now, another important theme of Black nationalism goes way back is the Back to Africa movement, which is predicated on the idea, which we see up until to the Nation of Islam, that in the 1960s, that this idea that African Americans cannot have cannot get equality in a white man's country, cannot get equality in an integrated America. And this goes way back. So Sierra Leone was set up by, this was an initiative of Granville Sharp, UK abolitionists, this idea of resettling African Americans who had fought for the British during the Revolutionary War. They ended up in places like Nova Scotia, where they're deeply unhappy for very good reasons, and hence this idea of resettling them in Sierra Leone. Doesn't go well. These experiments never tend to. The American Colonization Society is another one, 1817, white abolitionists. And establishing this colony in Liberia in 1822. Again, doesn't go super well, and Martin Delany tries it again in 1859 in the Civil War era. Martin Delany, famous physician who fights, calls his son Toussaint after Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian rebel, and fights during the Civil War under the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. So this, in any case, the point being, this idea is very old as well. Now, in the 20th century, there's a variety of these separate Black nationalist movements that take shape, a lot of them in the context of the Great Depression. And one of these is the Ethiopian peace movement, which is building bridges with Africans in the 1930s. And another is the Pacific movement of the Eastern world, which is a result of what's called the Black Dragon Society in Japan, working among African Americans, and which is fascinating as well. It's something definitely worth looking up. 49 State movement of Oscar Brown, which was about a separate state in the Union for blacks, kind of like how the Mormons had Utah. Or at one point it was a separate theocracy, they're also open to relocation to Japan, Brazil, or Africa. Now, Asia for the Asiatics, Africa for the Africans is an important theme in this, which I'll talk about again because it's a really important theme about decolonization after World War II. But the idea that Asia is for the Asiatics, Africa is for the Africans, Europe is for Europeans, and that's how it should be. Some of these are also Well, the most important, actually, which I'll talk about next, is Garvey's UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association. Garvey being the most important, I'll defend that just by the sheer numbers of those who follow him and become Garveyists, and that this movement peaks at about 6 million. Okay, so it's amazing, and he is quite a leader. He's from Jamaica. He's a union organizer who ends up in Brooklyn. By that point, he set up his United Negro Improvement Association, and his vision is a return to Africa, but he has a wider vision than that, where he sees Africa as a united state eventually, where he will be the leader. He will be the supreme leader of a unified Africa. So a real megalomaniac. You can see that in his self-designed uniform, which, much like George S. Patton, that idea that people will follow follow a new Napoleon, one who looks like that, right? He famously sets up the Black Star Line, so organizes his vision into a steamship company, which is going to take African Americans back to Africa, but gets convicted for mail fraud for selling shares in this company before any ships are made. Spends a couple of years in a jail in the States, and very controversial among other African American leaders of his time, both for him calling them out as being fools, much like Malcolm X would, but also because of his tight association with white supremacists. And that's consistent with his view, and we see that again with Nation of Islam and typically with Black nationalism, consistent because they share the same end goals. What we also get with Marcus Garvey is extreme, real anti-Semitism, which we'll also get with the Nation of Islam. But yeah, Garvey, very much very effective, but also a real lightning rod in his time, and some even in his day are saying he's being used by whites because he's a segregationist. And W.B. Du Bois called him, quote, the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America. And Du Bois is hardly he's an activist himself, right? So interesting. Some of these movements are about reclaiming a religious heritage as well, or inventing one that's completely utilitarian, that's functional, and that's all about building racial pride. And that's really the best way to understand the Nation of Islam, because it comes directly out of that pattern as well. And you first see this in what's called the Black Hebrew movement, or the Black Hebrew Israelites. And the claim of the Black Hebrew Israelites, and it's William Saunders Crowdy who starts this, is that Black people were the only authentic descendants of the ancient Israelites. And this is a late 19th century idea. In 1896 in Kansas, they built their first tabernacle. They are still around, and they're or branches of this are still around. The most anti-Semitic of which is known as the Nation of Yahweh, the Nation of Yahweh, which believes that whites are put on earth as a curse, and that God's chosen people will defeat them in the end, so that they are the Black Israelites. They are God's chosen people. Now, demonology of the white race here, obviously the same as we get in the NOI. Another example of this that's happening at the same time in the early 20th century is the Moorish Science Temple, which is fascinating as well. And this is established in 1913 in Newark, New Jersey, by the self-proclaimed prophet Noble Drew Ali, whose name was Timothy Drew. And this movement also claims this early, well, it claims that American blacks were the first people in the New World, that they're the ancient Moabites of the Old Testament, and that they're from the area of Morocco, so they're Moorish of origin, and again, the original people in America. So getting that lineage, that credibility, but also with linkages to the Quran. He says that the African American Moorish race were the founders of the city of Mecca, and he writes a few extra books. His biography essentially becomes the scripture of this movement, and is seen as a holy text added to the Quran. Also has ideas revisits ideas of who Jesus was, and in any case, and makes him a quote Asiatic, which is more or less accurate anyway. But Yeah, interesting movement. 1929, the movement splits in a fight over funding, and a rival leader sets up his own temple, and then he's found murdered in Ali's temple, which is a pretty clear case of kind of anticipates what we see with the Nation of Islam and the willingness to resort to violence. Ali is charged with this, but he is not convicted. Now, Prophet Drew Ali is also important because this movement is attracted one Wallace Dodd Fard, who becomes the founder of the Nation of Islam. He is an Ali follower. He is a Moorish congregant. Now, all these movements have one root, which is a lost faith in their white countrymen, even the so-called good ones, and that the way ahead is to separate first in order to go forward. And with that, you also have this very calculated effort to recapture the past, right? The African American past. And because one can't do that, because uh, it's been cut off through because of the nature of the Middle Passage, because it's anonymous, there's a lot of invention here. And Islam is seen as radical chic, okay? And it's not just in the 1960s that begins, and it is already in the 20s because it is the growing or the biggest global threat to the white man. You get a growing Islamism beginning in the 1920s in the Middle East mandates after World War I, and it spreads through, it becomes the voice of decolonization. It spreads through the Arab League to Egypt. The British actually established the Arab League, ironically, during World War I as a bulwark in the defense of their colonies there, and it becomes turned very much against them afterwards. But yeah, it spreads to the Arab League to Egypt and gives rise to Nasser and Nasserism, which eventually, in 1952, Nasser gains Egyptian independence, which is the beginning of the end of colonial rule on the African continent. Now, not all are thrilled with Nasser's vision because it it goes in a different direction from Black nationalism towards Westernization and modernization. So in Egypt, we get the Muslim Brotherhood being more consistent with Black nationalism, which still remains a force that is opposed to Nasserist ideology in Egypt to this day. But yeah, Ghana's first leader, Kwame Nkrumah, launches this unity movement, a far leftist movement, and is another important name in this. He's educated in the United States and in the UK, and he's inspired by Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois, actually, and he creates the Organization of African Unity. And again, the ideas here are decolonization, kick the white man out of Africa, back to Europe, right? Asia for the Asians, Asia for the Asiatics, Africa for the Africans. And this persists, right? This idea of Islam as radical chic, and we see that in the 1960s with things like Kwanzaa, which is a great example. It's an alternative to Christmas, and it's invented in 1966 as this Pan-African quasi-spiritual celebration. Okay, so it makes sense that the movement would gravitate to Islam, Black nationalist movement, because it is the dominant religion in Africa, especially North Africa, in the 20th century. But what's ironic about it is that it was the Muslims who began the African slave trade. They're the ones who started the trading and raiding of black people across the Sahara into the slave regions and brought them north to the big slave markets on the Moorish coast, on the Barbary coast. So the Moors were the world's really the beginning. This is the beginning of the African slave trade, is the Arab slave markets and the Barbary coast. So there's more than a little irony here, but none of this is about getting the history right. It's about being attracted to a religion of power in a time and place, and putting the African American struggle in the global context of decolonization, making connections between the African independence movement leaders whose radicalism inspires them and what's going on in the United States. Okay, and that's what needs to be understood. And the idea is that when these liberation movements actually gain independence, and this happens, then using them as a backdoor to bring their plight to the United Nations. Okay, so So this is what the African American Black nationalist movement is aiming to do. And they do that. They do that. They speak through these leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, right? But again, their point of view that decolonization is whites being chased back to Europe after centuries of dominating. It's the end of white supremacy. It's a return to racial separation. And all of this also means accepting the logic of racism. Hence, Garveyism could embrace the Klan because they're both after the same thing. Hence, too, this conflict between black nationalists and Jews. So you get things like the "Don't Buy Where You Can't Work" campaign by Sufi Abdul Hamid, who's one of the early Muslims in this movement. He gains the title of Harlem Hitler because he organizes boycotts against Jewish businesses in the 1930s, and he's very popular in the black community in New York. Now, anti-Semitism is a big part of this. And that theme is also at the heart of the Nation of Islam, which, as I said, Wallace Fard Muhammad founds this, and as I told you, he was a Moorish congregant. And so who is he and what's he about? Well, his real name is Wallace Ford, Ford or Fard. And he founds the Nation of Islam in Detroit in 1930. And this is right after he's getting off of 3 years in San Quentin for selling drugs. He moves to Detroit 1930. He said he was from Mecca. He told people he was a redeemer, and he capitalizes on anti-Semitism in Motor City, and he gains these followers who take it further, namely Elijah Poole, who takes over 4 years later as Elijah Muhammad. Okay, after Wallace mysteriously disappears. Now, the claim is made, of course, that Elijah Poole killed Wallace Fard, right? But there's no proof of that, and he is never charged with that. So Fard disappears, and Elijah Poole becomes the leader. Now, Poole is a factory worker from Georgia who came north, which is part of the Great Migration at that time, not at all uncommon. And first he was Fard's assistant, and then he said that Fard chose him as his messenger. After Elijah Muhammad died, Louis Farrakhan took that post, and Farrakhan actually famously took credit for Malcolm X's murder in a speech in 2000 or 2001. In any case, Fard or Ford's divinity remains the Nation of Islam position, and their website now says that we believe that Allah, God, appeared in the person of Master W. Fard Muhammad in July 1930, the long-awaited Messiah of the Christians and the Mahdi of the Muslims. So Fard was divine, and that remains the position of the Nation of Islam. And in that way, many Muslims say this is not Islam at all. And they're right in that the NOI invents a whole lot of things that go against the Quran. In other ways, it's very much like Islam itself. And what draws the movement to it is its message of power. Its message of power. Muhammad, if you know anything about him, was a 7th century warrior who appropriated what worked from religions around him, namely monotheism. He saw that was powerful in the Byzantine Empire among the Christians. So destroyed all the other idols in the Kaaba and told people to worship that one Allah alone, and that the people of Mecca from now on worship only that. Follow me and my 4 rules for living, and you will have ever-expanding success in battle. So the foe is the infidel or angel, right? So a couple things there that you see. One is that it's a legalist theology. You follow these paths and you get to that place, which is immensely attractive to people as a route to as a functional religion, as a functional path to self-betterment, to racial uplift, because it gives one the habits of having it together, right? And we see that forcefully in the movie. If you want an equivalent to this on the African continent, watch the movie The Battle of Algiers, and then investigate what the FLN was about, because it's very much the same kind of thing of fundamentalist Islam as a way to distinguish oneself and prove oneself worthy, right? That book, The Wretched of the Earth, is great for getting at what I'm talking about here, because the biggest problem of the colonized, as Fritz Fanon puts it in that, and the reason they're so violent to each other is because they have inculcated the colonizers' worldview, inculcated the European worldview that they are less. And the only way to rectify that is to fight against that, and actually the spilling of European blood is empowering that way, because it proves, it validates that Europeans are simply human. So if you're interested, go down that road and read the Introduction to the Wretched of the Earth by John Paul Sartre, because it's fascinating. It basically validates these kind of strategies. In any case, fratricidal violence, which is violence, black on black violence, or white on white, or whatever, is explained that way. That the colonized has that dispossession perpetuates because the colonized accepts their inferior status, right, and is more prone to kill their fellow man than they are their colonizer. Any case, so it makes sense that they would choose this religion, because it's largely ideology. It's an ideology of empowerment with very clear rules on what you do and on who is in and who is out, immensely appealing to marginalized people, where the faith journey and rehabilitation and self-confidence and gaining that capacity, reasserting oneself, are one and the same. So religion, again, has a functional role, gives you back your pride, your self-esteem, gives you the habits that mark you as having it together, which is exactly how Malcolm X defended Islam as the logical choice. And like Islam says, if you do, you will inherit the world, right? The real world, you will conquer. Now, with Nation of Islam, since this is racially constructed, it's about racial empowerment. It's blacks that will conquer over whites, which is good over evil. It becomes a racial victory. And therefore, whites must be evil. And therefore, you go with the idea that blacks are the original man, the chosen people. In Elijah Muhammad's words, black man by nature is divine. By nature, the white man is evil. He also calls them a filthy race of devils. In fact, he does that repeatedly, very, very often. Elijah Muhammad says this, so would Malcolm X. Now, in fact, you can look all this up if you want yourself, and so I won't belabor this, but Elijah Muhammad also helps create this theology that validates this idea of blacks as the original people, and advanced over whites, and whites as a curse. So he develops his own eschatology, but he's largely basing this on what he's already got from Fard, who was a devotee of Timothy Drew, as I said. So, but basically, it boils down to this: that blacks, their origins are the tribe of Shabazz. That was one of 13 tribes of people that lived on Earth 66 trillion years ago. Some mad scientist had gone rogue, and the other 12 tribes were destroyed along with most of the earth, and the tribe of Shabazz relocated to Central Africa, and they were technologically advanced people. At one point, much later, Yaqub, one of the Meccan tribe of the tribe of Shabazz, he goes rogue as well. So that original scientist went rogue. So does Yaqub, and he creates the white race through a policy of eugenics, and basically that is murdering the lighter skinned babies over a course of 150 years or so, and then his followers, I think it was 600 years or so, to perfect this other race, which are the filthy race of devils, the white people, which later on, and there's a lot more to it, but through technology and the eugenics program, Malcolm X describes it as bleaching, and through technology, the whites managed to get the upper hand and make the slaves, or make blacks into slaves, and reverse history that way. And through this narrative is wound, the Judaism and Islam are in there, so it incorporates Moses into the story, and Muhammad, and so it's a real merging, and then an attempt to historicize the black race through these other monotheistic religions, right? In any case, and it is exactly what I was talking about before, this attempt to validate and create a history, but one which and the subtext here is that this is the alternative to Christianity, which has failed Black people, and that's absolutely what where Elijah Muhammad and Wellsford Muhammad and Malcolm X land. That Christianity is a slave religion, and I don't mean slave religion like Nietzsche meant it. Nietzsche criticizes Christianity for being other-centered, for being pacifist, for being egalitarian, and this created the weakness that destroyed the Roman Empire. And you know, the pacifism side of Jesus, right? So it's a slave religion in terms of it's about the domination of Black people and turning them into slaves, and that is what the Nation of Islam reduces Christianity to. So it is reverse racism with the idea of separation as the only solution. And clearly, that's the theology, the eschatology is about that. The film does a great job with the conversion experience. It doesn't give us the out there theology as much, but it does. We are confronted with Malcolm X's views on white people for sure in the film. It does a good job of that, and it's very close to the autobiography of Malcolm X that he and Alex Haley wrote together. And it also, as I said, it does. The conversion experience is quite well done, and it's interesting. It's complete reversion on the Christian born again experience, and it's mentioned in the film and in the autobiography that how this happens, and it begins with Malcolm X meeting an NOI, a Nation of Islam individual in jail. He actually only meets him 10 times. That's Bimby, and he says he was the first man I'd ever seen command total respect with his words, and in those 10 meetings, he wins him over. And he's blinded with the reality of this message of the tribe of Shabazz and all the rest of it. This is the big revelation. And again, he compares it to what happened to Saul on the road to Damascus. And that's the Christian story of the Apostle Paul, who was originally a persecutor of Christians, and then on the road to Damascus, he's visited by Jesus and converts and changes his name to Paul. Okay, except that with that, the conversion, what one suddenly believes in then is one's own racial superiority, and this is how Malcolm X puts it to Alex Haley in a Playboy interview in 1963. I considered them as gods and goddesses until Mr. Muhammad opened my eyes and enabled me to see them as a race of devils. And then a paraphrase of what he says in his autobiography and interviews later on. The phrase, "the white man is the devil," clicked. It struck me like a blinding light. I was able to fall on my knees to Allah. So the film does a good job of that. It also does a good job with gender, or a decent job with gender anyway. And that's what the article this week is about, or gets at. And that's why I hope you find that one helpful. But it definitely hints at, if not investigates, probes the enforced gender norms, the patriarchy of this movement, right? Even though Betty Shabazz is a woman with a lot of agency, definitely, it is very much a patriarchal, if not misogynist, organization. These different Islamic, or definitely the Nation of Islam, and all these other groups that I mentioned before. The idea being, it's right there in their banners that they had at their mass rallies. We must protect our most valuable property, our women. Women seating separately from men, so separate seating in their synagogues, and modest dress, and what you would associate with Orthodox traditional Islam. And for men, the gendered norms are the protective role. We see that in the fruit of Islam, which is the paramilitary, and their code, that the responsibility of the freedom of Islam is that of head of a house, protection, provision, maintenance of the Nation of Islam, all original people. So patriarchal norms very much a part of what is happening here, and I'm interested to see what you think about that and how that comes out in the film after reading the article for this week. Of course, anticipating what you might discuss on that, there's the inherent misogyny in the fact that Elijah Muhammad is abusing women and taking advantage of them, and the film obviously confronts that and it exposes that as well for what it was, and consistent with any cult with male leadership, or with many of them, this is what ends up invariably happens. Where you might question whether Spike Lee soft pedals the NOI and its racist leanings is the fact that it doesn't give us this, which is the fact that neo-Nazis were very comfortable with the NOI and would attend their rallies and give speeches. And here we have George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the founder of the American Nazi Party in the post-war period, murdered at the age of 49 by one of his own men. Uh, it's attending an NOI, here he is at an NOI summit in 1961. And again, like Garvey, this makes sense because the end goals are the same. I guess Garvey's association with the Klan comes to mind here. And if you go on the NOI website today, you'll see that they have a plank of 10 positions, and the 10th one is this: we believe that intermarriage or race mixing should be prohibited. So yes, these are not strange bedfellows. This is consistent. Now, interesting as well, and the film doesn't go here, but Malcolm X is a bit of a political philosopher and almost a Marxist in his language, and like Marx, believes that capitalism is doomed. Capitalism is a white disease, and it will not survive because it is all about sucking blood out of victims, and so he sees economics through a racial lens and really believes like other African American leaders and Black nationalists of the past, that capitalism is going to collapse upon itself, and that its days are numbered. And I guess I also just want to say, and this is easy enough to verify for yourself by reading Malcolm X's autobiography, but also reading the historiography on him, which is just vast. I mean, there's been so many biographies on Malcolm X. Yeah, that in general, that it is consistent with the autobiography. It is consistent with what Malcolm X himself told Alex Haley, so his interpretation of his own life story and his from the beginning with his mother's hatred for her own skin color, accurate. His grandfather being white, accurate. His father's death at the hands of the Klan or vigilante white militia, probably accurate, not 100% known. He is killed in what goes down as a railway streetcar accident, but so that part accurate as well. And the main message, or one of the main messages, which is that he becomes much more powerful than Elijah Muhammad himself because of his amazing oratorical skills. So do look up some videos of Malcolm X speaking, and you'll just be blown away how well Denzel Washington channels him. He's like a better Malcolm X than Malcolm X almost. But Malcolm X is one powerful orator, very, very much so, and very compelling, and people wanted to be on his side. And this creates tension within the movement, so this too is accurate, right? But he is the number one reason that the NOI takes off, because after World War II, it's almost extinct. There's like 30 members, but when he gets on board in the 1960s, numbers go from about 500 when he joins. When he leaves, it's between 25,000 and 75,000 members, so somewhere in there, we're not 100% sure. Okay, so it really is him that creates this movement, and the film gives us that in spades. Yeah, so, but one of the historiographical debates is whether his childhood is really as depicted by his own memory, or if he's simply embellishing in order to make for a better narrative. And since Malcolm X's autobiography, since Alex Haley's book came out, a lot of research has been done. In 2011, over here we've got Manny Marable came out with this award-winning biography, and she made the point that he embellished a lot just so he could dramatize the story, right, of his redemption. More recently, I thought you would find this interesting. Les Payne, and some of you have used him in your essays. And Payne is a big name in civil rights historiography. He wrote a book called The Dead Are Rising. Actually, unfortunately, he didn't finish it because he died, and so his wife and prime main researcher finished it for him just very recently. And that was to set the record straight on this one. And he swings back the other way, where he says no, through a lot of interviews with family and with friends of Malcolm X in his early days, that it is more or less accurate, his autobiography. Another historiographical question, though, and something that the film brings up, which I think is worth mentioning, is it gives us a sense of a really truly converted Malcolm X who moves completely away from racism, and it gives us a sense that this is a fairly significant period of time as well, that it becomes a pretty developed and personal feeling. And just a reminder here that it's not necessary. This is not necessarily agreed upon, and least of all by those who were who were contemporaries of Malcolm X. Okay, so here's Ord Coombs talking about Peter Goldman's book, and Peter Goldman gives us that this idea, which I'll read for you. At the end of his life, Malcolm was at war with the Nation of Islam, avoided by the civil rights lions of the 60s, denounced as the anti-white demagogue in the news media, and coming apart under the pressure. And then he made a pilgrimage to Mecca, announced that he had met white Muslims who embraced him unselfconsciously, and that all white women were not the devils he had formerly imagined them to be. And here's Ord Coombs on that, and he says, this is a turnabout, it seems to me, that is as unconvincing now as it was then. Anyway, and unable to get the Organization of African American Unity off the ground, evicted from his home by the NOI, seeing traitors all around him, he died ignominiously at the hands of black men, denounced, as Maya Angelou tells it, through the Black Quarter of San Francisco. So there's a bit of hagiography going on in there that, and of course everyone becomes sanctified when they're martyred for their cause, and that Malcolm X did raise the profile of these issues, and that's the debate. To what extent did he do good for the cause, and to what extent did he not? Did he maybe delay things? Because he's definitely not building bridges with white America, okay? Because that message will never do that. It's impossible for white America to ignore him, but it's also impossible for them to treat him seriously. And so this is a good reminder that the film maybe engages too much in hagiography and doesn't give us a solid sense of how this went down at the time, or how he was received by other African American leaders, including by the famed leader Thurgood Marshall, who says what Dr. King believes he cannot say in that quote on the last slide. In any case, this takes us full circle back to looking at strategy, and between the two sides of these two voices, major voices in the civil rights movement, of which I did say the NOI is very, very much a marginal group, but with an outsized voice, and certainly Malcolm X is a media superstar. So, partly because of his outspoken racism, which is fascinating to Americans, but also because he lands himself in hot water in ways that are well depicted in the film, such as after the JFK assassination, when he says the chicken's coming home to roost. And I think this is really essential, because it gets to the fact that at the end of the day, he is not a violent man. He condones violence in what he says, and stops singing, starts swinging, and he is absolutely against non-resistance. And non-violence is a failed approach. Okay? Non-violence is not the way to go. And so he can point to what he says doesn't work, but he does not organize a violent organization. Okay? So, and yet it is internally, and that's the irony here, is that their brightest spokesman, when he learns that racism is not forward moving, ironically, after claiming for years that the NOI is not violent, he ends up being killed by them. And this gets us back to the point that the NOI simply cannot build bridges with with a wider America. It doesn't have a solution that works. Right? At one point, they talk about 3 states, that there may be several states that in the South that would be the homeland for African Americans, but always cagey about how that would work and what that would look like. But this is a message that, again, it's impossible for white America to ignore, but also impossible for them to treat seriously. So given that separation is a non-starter, King's approach makes far more sense, and integration, which and also the fact he can't call whites white devils, but he does call them hypocrites, and he can and does tell them that they're not who they say they are, and that he is closer to the truth that they say they believe in. And that's key, right? He says he is closer to the truth that they say they believe in. He's of the same faith, but he knows what it means, right? And refuses to hate his enemies, unlike whites. And that is immensely indicting. It's a critique from the inside, and it wins overall with the worst case rednecks, right? Which is namely a good-sized section of the South. But what he does is he exposes the evil that they are. Today, the term is you hear all the time is gaslighting, right? And that's the brilliance of his strategies in the South, is revealing what white supremacy looks like, how ugly it is, and then seeing the white power structure have to respond to that. First with Kennedy, and then with Johnson with the Civil Rights Act. And a very reluctant White House gets on side with Martin Luther King's agenda, the SCLC agenda, the Big Six agenda, the dominant civil rights movement, as we see them come together in Freedom Summer in the South in 1964. And this is really where the change is happening. This is where progressive change is happening. And as King understands, it's nowhere near enough. And this is an important place to end it too, that he does remain a Jeremiah. And in fact, he gives up that access to the power circles, gives up his access to Lyndon B. Johnson, because he will not be silent on what he sees as the biggest problems. And towards the end of his life, he sees it as economic inequality, as well as the war in Vietnam, which really annoys Johnson because he won't shut up about his opposition to that. So he will, but economic inequality being what must happen, what must be worked on before we get racial equality in America. In any case, that is the story and the glory. And obviously, they both meet their demise in very similar ways shortly after each other. Hope you enjoyed that lecture. Hope you got something out of it, and I hope you enjoyed that choice of a film. And I guess that's it for me. Any questions, as usual, I am always here. Let me know. Take care.